being here. Thanks, Francesco, for helping me with this session. Thanks to the participants, and an especially warm welcome to the speakers who accepted to be here and provide their insights. As you all know, the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference took place very recently from the 31st of October to 12 November in Glasgow. The UK, host of the conference in partnership with Italy, declared that the COP26 would aim at securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, as well as to protect communities and natural habitats. So there were high expectations that the participating governments would spend their political willingness to tackle the interlinked challenges of public health, climate change, and biodiversity loss. So, but to what extent did the conference succeed in achieving at least some of these aims? This is something that we're going to discuss today with the help of an excellent panel of experts. Before we start, I will tell you a little bit how this session is structured. I will ask 2 rounds of questions to the speakers, to which they will reply rather quickly, after which we will open the floor for the Q&A session. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, as Francesco will be monitoring the chat to that purpose. So our speakers, the first one to speak will be Dr. Niki de Sy, who is an assistant professor at the Laboratory of Geo-information Science and Remote Sensing of the Wageningen University. She specializes in interdisciplinary research on land use change dynamics, climate change mitigation, and sustainable development. She also conducts research on national forest monitoring for REDD+, drivers of tropical deforestation, and the role of Earth observation in achieving transformational change towards climate and forest-friendly food systems. And then we have Professor Elisa Morgera. Elisa is Professor of Global Environmental Law and the Director of the One Ocean Hub, also a member of the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance. And she specializes in international, European, and comparative environmental law with a particular focus on the interaction between biodiversity law and human rights, but also equity and sustainability in natural resource development, oceans governance, and corporate accountability. And last but not least, our own Professor Josephine van Zeben, who is the chair of the law group of the Wageningen University. Her research focuses on the regulation of environmental issues by public and private actors across jurisdictions, with particular attention for polycentric governance theory and developments related to the European Union. And she's also the research lead of the law group's program, Law for the Living Environment. So we are really honored to have this excellent panel of speakers today. And without further ado, I will start with Niki, asking her to break the floor. And Niki, you are an expert, as we said, in land use change dynamics, deforestation monitoring, among other things. And in the past, you have also attended the Conference of the Parties, not this year, but you have followed its works from a distance. So I would like to ask you, what were the thematic areas that you followed more closely, and what were the relevant decisions or commitments that emerged from COP26 in those fields?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, so unfortunately, I wasn't able to go this year, but in the past, I've mainly followed negotiations around REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation and carbon enhancement. Of course, that was sort of, these negotiations were somehow finalized at one moment, and I think a lot of this has also been sort of incorporated into the Paris Agreement and in the countries' NDCs. But I still follow sort of also this year try to follow what's going on with specifically more tropical forests and deforestation commitments. And I think at least they were at a lot in the focus, I would say, of this COP. It was a very, people say it was a very basically nature-oriented, forest-oriented COP. And there were, of course, a few very interesting commitments that came out. And I think one of them came out quite quickly in the beginning of the COP, where you had this Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, where specifically, I think quite a lot of countries, like 120 countries covering 90% of the world's forests, committed to halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation by 2030. And I think it's interesting that they also specifically mention that they do that while delivering also on sustainable development and promoting inclusive rural transformation. I just want to mention that this was also mentioned in this pledge together with the halting and reversing forest loss. And a few days later, what also came out was more, I think, signed by the EU. Some specific countries in the EU and US was also a global forest finance pledge, where they also pledged to provide something like $12 billion to actually help with that pledge on forests and halting and reversing forest loss. So that's really forest-related climate finance, and to provide that over the next 5 years. To support and incentivize that forest pledge. There was also interesting a specific pledge for the Congo Basin, which, I mean, because we are also in our research focusing more and more on the Congo Basin, I think this region has maybe received a bit less attention than, for example, Brazil and Indonesia. But there's, of course, also still a very huge intact forests in this Congo Basin, and there's a lot of pressures also in these countries for deforestation and forest degradation. So there was another pledge for freeing about $1.5 billion also to support the Congo Basin specifically, and they also mentioned peatlands, which, of course, in light of climate change mitigation, is a very important ecosystem to protect. And for me also then another very interesting commitment that came out was more related to agricultural commodities and forests. This was the forest, agriculture and commodity trade. This is specifically, and I think this was more committed by companies, so that they commit to sort of making their whole agricultural commodity trade more sustainable, while, you know, and also protecting forests and critical ecosystems. So I think that for me were the sort of the main commitments coming out of that. And I think there was also some development banks that also made a commitment to look at basically financing agriculture, and moving that financing away from unsustainable practices, I believe. And for me, what was very interesting, of course, one is that there was a lot of attention for forests and nature, but also that the link between deforestation and agricultural driven deforestation was made so specifically this COP. I think in the time of REDD+, which is a few years ago, there was some mention of, okay, we need to address the drivers of deforestation, but it was never really specifically linked to agriculture. While I think it's already known also from the research I do and others in my field that agriculture is a very big factor in driving these land use changes, especially in the tropics. I'm speaking here specifically about the tropics. And I think for me that is a very big step, that now it's explicitly mentioning, okay, and it's also commodity driven agriculture. So it's not the smallholders eating a little bit away at the edges of the forest. It's really these international sort of commodity driven agriculture that has to be tackled as well. So for me, that was a very big thing that came out of that it was put so front and center. And I think that's what I mainly followed. What I wanted to follow, but haven't really managed to wrap my head around yet, is more sort of what was happening around enhanced transparency framework, and sort of how are countries in a transparent way monitoring what they promised, and sort of what their progress is, and also how we can hold them accountable. But I haven't really figured out yet the details of that, and because it's often these things are very complicated. Yeah. So I think that was my quick wrap up of the things I saw coming out of the COP.
Thank you very much, Niki. So it seems that there is an enhanced, perhaps, systems approach to the issues that you have described. And of course, this webinar is happening just a few days after the closure of the works. So these are really immediate reactions to the conference. But of course, in the next few months, there will be more to see and to say about how governments will act upon their commitments. And speaking of which, I would like now to give the floor to Elisa, who actually attended the COP26 on behalf, I think, of One Ocean Hub. One Ocean Hub actually hosted several hybrid events during the conference. And I would like to ask Elisa, what was your main focus during COP26, the main focus of your participation, and what do you think were the most notable commitments undertaken by the parties in those focus areas?
Yes. Now, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'll share a couple of slides. My participation at the COP was very much focused on the ocean, but also on really understanding, having that systemic ecosystem approach to climate change in the ocean and biodiversity, including human rights-based approaches. And of course, I mean, the previous COP led by Chile and Spain had been labeled the Blue COP, had really raised the importance of the ocean, this forgotten biggest, part of our planet. And so there were expectations which the UK presidency supported about this COP really being an opportunity for us to reap the benefits of that preparatory work. Definitely a lot of members of the scientific community working on the oceans were there. And there were certain important also financial pledges made to the role of the ocean in the context of climate change. But of course, we wanted to see what the decisions will be about. And I think it is important to keep in mind that, of course, climate change may become one piece of a very complex governance puzzle that relates to the oceans, and that already addresses the relationship between the ocean and climate change. And this is the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and to some extent the rules under the law of the sea and, say, regional fisheries management organizations. They've all been gearing up, and there are already opportunities from a legal perspective to address climate change. But the question was, we need the climate change, the center of climate change governance to equally include and respond to our understanding of both the role of the ocean in mitigating climate change, as well as the needs of the ocean to adapt to climate change. And so what happened in Glasgow is that the Climate Pact, this kind of overarching kind of policy narrative decision, did ask for all the UNFCCC work programs and bodies to integrate, to consider how to integrate and strengthen ocean-based action in their mandates and work plans and report back. So this is not quite saying that they have to integrate right away. And we know, because of the urgencies of both climate change and the biodiversity crisis, it would have been maybe preferable to have more urgent action. But at least we had the start of that from an institutional perspective. It is very broad ranging in terms of going across all the work packages and programs. And the reporting back is a certain measure of accountability, of really showing what can be achieved in the next year to that end. Also, the kind of more higher level attention is going to be kept on the ocean and climate change. And so a dialogue to strengthen ocean-based action has become an annual recurrence. And this is really good, just to raise the profile, because many climate players might still not be fully on board in terms of understanding of the role of the ocean and the needs of the ocean in the context of climate change. And maybe more importantly, there's also emphasis on the need to conserve and restore nature, including marine ecosystems. And that's really crucial, as our decade is both the decade for ocean science and for ecosystem restoration. So we have important opportunities of these other processes to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, but also to take some action in other areas. And this is really crucial because we are lagging a bit behind, I think, in the full understanding of how human rights are impacted by an unhealthy ocean. We know, I think, much better now, and there's much more awareness about how our human rights are affected by climate change. But in terms of the relationship, the nexus between the ocean and climate change and what that means for indigenous people's rights, small-scale fishers' rights, everyone's right to health, and particular communities that may be affected by certain processes in the ocean and the impacts of climate change on the ocean. We really need more work there. And hopefully all these processes, and the CBD in particular, have already done some work there. And it's important that wherever progress is made in all these fora, including the climate change regime, we do take those considerations into account. Now, another aspect that maybe has been less prominent is that ocean plastics has become a very big program, and several international instruments and processes are addressing it. I think also the human rights dimensions of ocean plastics and the broader question of plastic life cycle have become very prominent this year, thanks to the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics. And we know that within UNEP, we might start soon treaty negotiations on this. But the climate change regime can also play an important role, and crucially, because also from a human rights perspective, and from the perspective of preventing more ocean plastics pollution, we need to take action at the very early stage of production of plastic, which is linked to oil and gas production. And so the commitment in the Glasgow Pact on phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies might play a role also in addressing the production of plastic, which then leads to ocean plastics. But otherwise, I think it's also important to keep in mind that, at the science, we're not quite as advanced as we are maybe in terms of terrestrial ecosystems and climate change. And in fact, ocean science itself doesn't really quite give us all the answers we need. It's quite common to say, and it's very true, that we know more about outer space than we know about the deep seas, for instance. And so it's very important that in the work of the scientific and technical body of the, in the climate change regime, we have noted the importance to continue to understand and advance knowledge, particularly on tipping points and incremental transformations, including in the ocean. And once again, we have those 2 decades that are really crucial. I was privileged to present together with other UN bodies at the Rio Pavilion on the opportunities for the ecosystem restoration decade, to also address that really the ocean and climate nexus, both from mitigation and adaptation purposes, but very much taking into account all the different layers of human rights guarantees and safeguards and opportunities to do that work in a much more integrated and equitable way. And with that, really also reflecting on the importance of the role of researchers in those processes and how we need to be responsible from a human rights perspective. And just recently, I've been discussing with colleagues involved in the Ocean Science Decade what that can mean for the work ahead, which I think will be crucial for climate change purposes too. So I'll stop there now, and we can talk about what's left to be done at the next break.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Very interesting. We will go back to these themes later. In the meantime, I would like to give the floor to Josephine, because the European Union has often portrayed itself as a value-based global actor. And for instance, we have seen during the UN Food System Summit that we discussed in our first Rapid Reaction Seminar, that the EU presented itself as a leader in promoting sustainable food systems through its own Green Deal, its Farm to Fork strategy. Now, I'd like to ask you, how did the EU approach the COP26 in light of this self-narrative as a value-based global leader, and how does the EU aim at leading the way?
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you also to Niki and Elisa for already these very valuable insights on areas that I didn't follow as closely. So I think when we look at the European Union, obviously with the Green Deal and then the recent adoption of Fit for 55, the EU has really set a very ambitious target for itself, or at least it itself believes that this is a very ambitious target. And I think that's not entirely untrue if we look at what needs to be done. And also and I think this is a very important point, which I'll come back to again later, the fact that in the end, the European Commission, who's trying to push for these initiatives through the Council and through other means, in the end is still subject to the preferences and the policies of the member states. And the member states on this are not presenting a united front, and there are very different kind of interests. in the different member states. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the European Union as a leader in this area, because I think the Commission has quite a big job already in being a leader within the EU. I think that's one of the challenges that they're facing. Now, the adoption of Fit for 55, which is the sort of legislative and policy package, which is supposed to achieve some of the elements of the Green Deal. I think there's some really interesting elements in there which came at a very timely moment, including the climate law, for example, which sets out binding targets for reductions, but also a different timeline and different powers for the European Union to act in the absence of those timelines or reduction targets being met. So I think that's a really interesting background to this meeting. Now, I think another thing to keep in mind is that the EU has been in a position where it has wanted to take leadership on this issue for a very long time. Obviously, when the US was under a different president, and also more generally when they, for instance, in Kyoto did not take quite the leadership role that they could have taken, I think the EU has seen an opportunity there, and I think it's tried to use that opportunity. However, if we look back to, for instance, COP15, which is generally also not perceived as a very successful COP, the EU is very ineffective. There's some really interesting, I think now at this point, people are happy to sort of look back at these events and be a bit more forthright about what was happening. And I think there's some really interesting insights coming out of people who were there who said, you know, listen, we were basically scrambling for the entire conference. And then at the end, all of a sudden, you know, there were some people in a room and we were not in that room. And then there was an agreement and we weren't really there. And I think that's something obviously that the EU is trying to prevent very, very hard in the current situation. And I think in part they've done this. I mean, if you look at the council position, so that's the shared common position of the member states, the official position of the European Union going into the COP, and I'll show you some of the highlights of that in a second. I think the EU has been relatively successful in the Climate Pact actually reflecting some of those goals that they had for this process. Nevertheless, I think what we're seeing from the EU, the picture that's emerging, is actually, I think, less positive than they would like it to be. I don't think they're generally seen as the leader that they would like to be for two reasons. One is that point of internal division, which I think is difficult. And then the second, actually there's three reasons. The second one is that a lot of what the EU has been doing and where it's been relatively effective is by pushing in negotiations which are not as visible, so not the grandstanding sort of statements, but in sort of more technical negotiations, unleashing its very, very skilled set of negotiators in those kind of meetings and trying to push for certain kinds of outcomes. And I mean, that's of course a level of effectiveness, but it's not quite the charismatic, you know, sexy picture that maybe you would like to emerge. Now, I think the final thing that's important is that in taking its internal actions and by adopting the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 and all other kinds of policies within the EU, and I think especially here also of the carbon border adjustment, the EU is, you know, not everyone is delighted with these measures. Now, some people are obviously happy that this is happening, and hopefully these kind of measures will be to the benefit, especially of the ones most negatively affected by climate change. But there are, of course, also many partners, including also the US, but also China, India, Brazil, you know, the bigger players that we've seen emerge also in COP, who are not willing to follow this kind of line and see these kind of measures as very unilateral attempts for the EU to impose its policies rather than actually present a vision and a leadership in this area. So I think all these things are eroding to some extent the degree to which the EU can offer positive leadership. Now, maybe just going back to the distinct elements of the COP goals that were reflected in the Council conclusions previous to the COP, one of the main aims of the EU was to complete the rule book that was set out before. So to really have a very clear structure to achieve the goals that Paris had set out. And that includes, for instance, having a more comprehensive view of what Article 6 would entail. So Article 6 relates to emission trading and carbon markets. and the implementation of that. And they have very high hopes for this, including also in Article 6.8, the elaboration of a work program for non-market approaches on carbon. So these were the kind of things that the EU wanted to achieve. A second big aim was indeed to agree on this enhanced transparency framework, which was also mentioned by Niki, and to increase capacity building and technical assistance in relation to those kind of issues. And then finally, I mean, there were some sub-goals as well, but finally also there was a big part of the adaptation goals and a collective quantified goal on climate finance. And I think if we look at the Climate Pact, I think actually a lot of these goals have been at least, acknowledged and I think to some degree achieved. I think the completion of the rulebook is, I think, an important part of what the Climate Pact has done. Now, it's not perfect. I think there are, obviously now that we've survived COP26, we can look at the next one. There are things that need to be done in a year from now. And that's, I mean, there's something to be said about that. But of course, the positive is that some of these things would otherwise have been agreed on in 5 years from now. For example, the reconsideration of nationally determined reduction goals, that was all a commitment. That was otherwise a 5-year timeline, and now it's a 1-year timeline. So that is, I think, a good thing. As to the enhanced transparency framework, some of those have also partially been achieved. I mean, I think this is really one of the things where the proof will be in the pudding, and it's very difficult to now say whether the words on paper are actually going to lead to greater accountability and transparency. I think it's something that we have to see in practice. And then I think for me at least, the most disappointing element of this COP has been related to the adaptation goals. So obviously progress has been made, and to be fair, the EU has committed a fair share of funds to this goal. So for example, they have doubled their own pledges. They are still one of the biggest contributors at this point to the climate fund. There's also some bilateral agreements, for instance, the one made with South Africa on the just energy transition partnership. I mean, I don't want to say that these are not important steps. However, and this is maybe something that others will have seen if they followed the reporting on this, the part of adaptation, I think, that we should really recognize explicitly is also the conversation of loss and damage, and the fact that there is really a very serious impact already now on people around the world, indigenous people, that is already there, and the unwillingness. I think if the EU really would have wanted to take moral leadership on this issue, they would have accepted some language on loss and damage, and they did not. They did not do this in their own council considerations. They did not do this throughout, and I think that's really a shame. And I think that's where maybe leadership could have come in, and that's not what happened. I'm really curious because Elisa was actually there on the ground, if any of these conversations were ones that you were maybe part of as well, or were witness to, because I think this is really something that for me is the biggest failure of this COP. So I think I'll just leave it there for now, but I'm happy to obviously, provide more. And maybe actually one very small part. I think one of the things, if you're, I was based previously in the UK, and now obviously having gone back to continental Europe, I think one of the really interesting elements, of course, of this COP is the fact that this is done under UK leadership, which, until very recently was part of the European Union, and also I think an important element of setting its environmental and climate policies, sometimes in a very positive way and sometimes in a less positive way, but nevertheless a very important player. And I think the fact that now the UK is no longer part of that, I think is a really interesting dynamic as well, but it's one that's maybe not as visible, but it's just one that, as a hobbyist, I find very, very interesting to watch. But I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to comment on any of this in more detail.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I will move to the second round of questions indeed, because of course it is important also to discuss more in detail the criticalities of the COP26, some of which Josephine has already pointed out. And so I will start with Niki and Elisa, because I would like to ask you both from your own thematic perspective to reflect on the remaining gaps. So what is that COP26 failed to adequately address, and why, in your opinion? So I will start with Niki. Niki, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, what I always, I mean, having all these commitments is very nice, of course, but for me, and this is maybe very personal reflection, the fact that this forest declaration came so soon and almost so easily sort of makes it, for me, maybe less valuable. Because, you know, this news came out and, hey, there's this declaration of forests and we're committed to halt and reverse forest loss. And then immediately I thought, okay, probably Brazil is not going to sign this. But then it turned out that Brazil did sign it. And for me, that was almost a reason to take it less seriously, because, you know, this country hasn't shown any willingness, on the contrary, in the last few years to tackle deforestation, while they did actually, after 2005, they have the monitoring system in place. There was you could see that the deforestation went down. And of course, then you had this change in political leadership. So then I think it's how realistic is that to assume that if nothing has been done in the last few years, and then on the contrary, you know, they were all for deforestation and supporting agri-businesses, if it's that easy to sign a commitment, you know, how realistic is it to assume that suddenly this country makes how do you say that, 180-degree turn to actually start doing something about it? So it's a commitment on paper. And interestingly, what you see also immediately after is sort of the how do you do the interpretation of the language that is used? If I read halt deforestation, I think about a zero deforestation commitment, which is basically, you know, you keep the forests that you have, the intact biodiverse forests, and then you do, even on top of that, you do restoring, you know, other parts. But then immediately after, I read I think an article on Manga Bay where you saw that the Indonesian officials started to play with words basically a little bit, and they said, no, we signed that, but we're not planning on sort of not deforesting anymore. Our interpretation is not ending it. Halting for us means that we can still deforest, but we just compensate that with restoration elsewhere. And that is, of course, a very different thing. And you know, their arguments are always, you know, we need that for development, and you know, and I'm not having, you know, you can have different opinions about what is, you know, whether that's a good argument or not, but it's sort of, okay, the word playing is already starting like a day after. So that sort of makes it it's a paper pledge basically. And what of course is missing very much in this commitment is it's not legally binding as far as I know, although I know there has been some court cases that, you know, for example, for Shell in the Netherlands, and sort of that there is some precedence that it might be legally binding, but not in international law, basically, as far as I understood. But people here probably know that better than me. And there's not a lot of sort of, like, for example, also reversing forest loss. There's no quantification of that. It's still a very vague commitment. And I think it's clear to me and many others with me that we're not talking in general, if you think about the Paris Agreement, about tweaking business as usual a little bit to reach our goals. We have to change the system across a lot of different aspects. And also, if you what Elisa said, the oceans have to come into that, and you know, it's a very complicated thing. And I think if you take these pledges seriously, what you really need is sort of, how are we going to follow through on them? And that is also, of course, a bit missing. You know, you need clear implementation plans. You need performance indicators. You need milestones. So how are you? 2030 seems very far away, and if you keep sort of putting it on the long term, then we're not going to get there. So all of that, of course, is a little bit missing. Maybe also the COP is not the place for that, but there should be a strong push to start developing these things. Also, I think we as researchers can play a very important role in that as well. And what is particularly interesting for me, I think what should be part of this as well. How are we going to monitor this? How are we going to report on the progress? How are we going to keep, you know, these countries and companies we should be able to hold them accountable. And I think that's a very important aspect that is missing a lot in these commitments. Where is the accountability? How are we going to technically do that? But also, can we hold them accountable with these kinds of commitments? And I think that's going to be very interesting. Otherwise, it might just say a paper pledge, I'm afraid. So I'm trying to be optimistic, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done and needs to be worked out to be able to reach these commitments. And, you know, deforestation hasn't really gone down in the last decade. And there has been earlier declaration, like the New York Declaration of Forests. So I'm wondering what is different now. And I think but I hope, like, for example, and maybe Josephine knows more about that, I saw in the news a few days ago that the EU has now sort of committed when it comes to, I think, coffee and cacao commodity trade, sort of changed that they will, I think, zero deforestation even. So maybe these kind of commitments coming from specific countries or regions and saying, okay, this we will target and commit ourselves to. Maybe that is then what comes out of this and could be made more specific and accountable. Yeah, so that is a little bit my general reflection on sort of what is happening and what is also still missing, I think.
Thank you very much, Niki. Very clear. In the meantime, I would like to let you know that there are around 50 people attending, so it's very nice to have you here. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, because after this round of questions, we will open the floor for a Q&A session. I will now give the floor to Elisa with the same question about the remaining criticalities.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I will go a bit on a limb here, because I will be speaking about some aspects of the climate change regime that I'm not an expert with. But I think it is really important, as both Niki and Josephine said, to really ask those questions. And if as experts we're not able to answer ourselves, partner, create research collaboration where we are able to really better understand. And I think, you know, many colleagues that have worked for a long time about embedding the oceans in the climate regime, so they were relatively happy with the results. But the reality is that we need to see that progress in mitigation for the ocean and ocean health really to be more protected from the impacts of climate change. And I think in terms of the atmosphere at the COP is that for how much the UK presidency did really well in terms of PR and all those pledges, it was very unclear how much these pledges, what they would really mean, and how much of a difference they would make, and whether or not they would be included in nationally determined contributions. So the question about how much progress we've made in terms of mitigation, I think, is open. There's different assessments out there about how these pledges, what they amount to, together with the NDCs. It's interesting that at least there's been some language about, you know, really working towards a 1.5 degree, including global carbon dioxide reductions by 45% by 2030. And that, again, for the ocean is really important, because in addition to all the various impacts that climate change has on the ocean, it's specifically CO2 emissions that create ocean acidification. And so that particular commitment is really relevant. But as Josephine was said, there was a lot of disappointment around adaptation and even more around loss and damage. There are processes that have been put in place to kind of keep the conversation going, but it's really very unclear at the moment how seriously, how seriously we're progressing on this. And in that sense, the Scottish government first move to provide funding for loss and damage was very symbolic and very important. But the work there really remains to be done. And I think some of the climate experts think that maybe the next COP will very much be a loss and damage COP, or it will be expected to be. As I was looking and expecting other significant outcomes, I think I was definitely looking for finance, for a much clearer commitment to really looking at ecosystem-based and human rights-based solution on ocean, climate, and biodiversity. We have the usual references to GO benefits. There were some advancements on finance, but I would imagine that the climate finance experts might not be particularly, I think, thrilled by the outcomes. And I think in terms of nature-based solution, there's really only one reference I could find, really having to dig for it, about, again, continuing the conversation, having a forum that feeds into, the thinking on finance and nature-based solutions. But clearly that's not enough to really influence the decisions in all the very complex climate finance structures. And maybe the other point that's really interesting is that maybe one of the more widely seen success of the COP26 has been finalizing the rule book, and that has been very controversial because we already know what have been the drawbacks of the carbon markets, and certainly there were a lot of human rights advocates who were were disappointed about the fact that there weren't human rights safeguards included in the rule book. And while we have, again, quite a lot of evidence about how things went wrong on land in terms of terrestrial carbon, we have a lot of research and hope about blue carbon also as a way to really value the ocean's role in climate change. But we have to be careful that those mistakes that have been made before are not then replicated in the context of the ocean if the work of blue carbon goes ahead. And finally, maybe to me, the biggest disappointment, and I think it's a widely shared disappointment at the COP, was that this was indeed a very non-transparent and non-inclusive COP, partly for very complex logistic questions related to the global pandemic. But the reality is that even for those who were there, who made it there, almost nobody had access to the negotiating rooms. And even more importantly, as part of the package of decisions adopted in Glasgow, there was a whole work program on action for climate empowerment, and everybody expected reference to procedural human rights there, and none was included. Now, the Glasgow Climate Pact tried to make up for that, saying that they recognizes the important role of indigenous peoples, local communities, children, and others that are human rights holders, and emphasizes the need to promote respective human rights obligations in implementing that work program. Now, how much that will make a difference, it remains to be seen. But again, just thinking about who was listened to at that COP. So the fact that the Climate Pact includes now an annual youth-led climate forum may look quite good in terms of PR, but all the youth representatives at the COP were asking for being included in the negotiations, not having separate youth-focused events. That's really not what their participation is. So I think there's a lot of work there, as in many other international forums, about really creating real participation and real opportunities for co-developing solutions that are integrated and inclusive of different concerns, and certainly need to, at the very minimum, to respect human rights. So I'll stop there sharing.
Thank you very much, Elisa. I find it very interesting also to hear about these criticalities regarding the inclusivity of the event that very much mirror also the problems of the UN Food System Summit that was held earlier this year. And we actually discussed it. I will put the link in the chat to the first rapid reaction seminar if you want to also listen to that, because some of the issues around inclusivity and the cosmetic participation are really similar. Now I would like to move on to Josephine. Josephine, going back to what we discussed earlier concerning the role of the EU, you have already actually highlighted some criticalities. In particular, ahead of the conference, the EU had to face some problems concerning, for instance, the opposition of some countries to its proposed policies, like the carbon pricing policies, or the difficulty in agreeing on a common negotiating position among the member states ahead of the COP26. So I would like to ask you, could you tell us about these critical aspects a bit more in detail?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually just building on from Elisa's last point about the transparency of this COP, I mean, I think, and also linking, of course, to your question about how this division has impacted the EU's strategy on this COP, I think maybe everybody knows this, but I found this when I first was looking into the structure of the COP, I was really taken aback by this. So really the COP was almost, I think you could almost speak of three COPs, right? There was the blue zone, the things that were happening there. So these were the negotiations between heads of state and those kind of actors. And then there's the green zone where we had all the, the workshops, some of the keynote speeches, all these kind of things. A lot of civil society was there. And then there was almost a third COP, which where you had a lot of the companies, I think, and a lot of the private actors also obviously involved in these kind of things. And I think just linking on to one of the points that was made previously before moving on to the EU specifically, I think one of the things that hasn't received as much attention, and perhaps rightfully so, because I mean, a lot of this might be greenwashing, but there have been statements made by industries and groups of industry on the things that they would like to act on, right? And I think while that might not be effective, ultimately, I do think that keeping these two things separately, especially when it comes to climate finance, is quite problematic, because there are no governments in the world that can finance this, can finance us out of this crisis. Like, we need the involvement of private sector as well. And I think in that sense, maybe dividing the COP in this way is not the most effective and transparent way, especially because it excludes very important voices like those of younger people and indigenous people. But also, I think in the end, we need to at least acknowledge that the private sector is a very important point on this. Now, going back to the EU, I already mentioned, I'm sorry to have preempted these questions, but I already mentioned a couple of divides in the EU. I think maybe one of the most striking examples of how divided the EU is on some of these issues is at some point early on in the COP, there was the signing of a pledge on of countries that committed to no longer build or invest in new coal power, and Poland actually was one of the countries that also signed this pledge, only then, a few hours later, to withdraw from this pledge again and unsign, as it were. And I think this is just really exemplary of the kind of things that we're seeing, which are really difficult for the EU. I think the package that we have in the EU itself has been very hard fought, and I think it's also, its implementation is going to take a lot of continued bargaining between the member states and the Commission and the member states. And I think one of the most important things maybe to keep in mind about European environmental and climate policy is that, and I hate to say this as a lawyer, but the law is not the problem. The law is all there. Like, if we would be doing everything that we have already in these packages, we would be living in a very clean, very, we're on our way. But the problem, of course, has been, and this has been the problem also if you look at the pre-existing targets for 2030 before the Green Deal sort of additional push, was that we were not reaching any of these targets, not even close. And I think that's, of course, the gap between what is there in the books and the actual implementation and enforcement. I think that's the real challenge. And I think that is the same, as Niki also mentioned, for these kind of declarations. I mean, in the end, on paper, it all looks amazing, but if it's not implemented and enforced, then, and I understand that this is almost a cliche at this point, but I think it's very important to mention. Now, I think there are some glimpses of hope. For instance, there's been now under Article 6, this establishment of international credits for emission trading, which actually build on existing work that was there, but still it's an interesting sort of addition. And the EU has already said that they are not going to be using any of these international credits that they could be gaining in other countries to achieve their NDCs. And I think that's good. That's, otherwise that would mean a further erosion of the EU's commitments. But these are very small glimpses of hope. What I'm actually hopeful for, but I mean, Elisa is far more expert on this than I am, is I'm hoping that on biodiversity, the EU is going to be more ambitious than the international level right now, because of course after this COP we now have COP15 of the CBD coming up, which is I would say more important at this stage than the climate. I mean if we don't halt this biodiversity loss now, then there's no climate left to save. And I think that's something where I'm really hoping that the EU is going to step up as well. But it's a very difficult issue. Let me see if there's anything I did not touch on as to this question. I mean, so basically the main takeaway, I think, is that implementation is where the real battle is going to be fought. And I think the problem with the implementation and enforcement battle is that, unlike the COP, it's not as visible as, it's not a visible, sexy issue, and there's not, always hundreds and thousands of people marching in the street. And I think that's really something that we also, as an academic community, I feel have a certain responsibility to really keep pushing on, because I think the more we empower citizens to see what is happening in terms of implementation and enforcement, I think the more we have a chance of it actually happening. And I think also just, writing critically on what's there in the books and what's there in practice, I think is something that we could contribute to as academics as well. But I'll leave it there, and I saw that a lot of interesting questions were being posed, so I'm very happy to engage with those.
Thank you very much, Josephine, and to all three speakers. And concerning COP15 on CBD, I think we will probably organize the third or the fourth rapid reaction seminar around that. And I think it's time to open the floor for a Q&A session. And I'd like to ask Francesco whether he would like to help with that, perhaps ask the questions that have already been posed in the chat?
Yeah, sure, Chiara. So we have many questions. I would like to start with two specific questions about forests addressed to Niki. So let me go through the chat. And so first of all, we have a question from Nila, who is asking that, is the facts of forest agriculture and commodity trade roadmap pledged at COP26 then a replacement of READ Plus, so the Varsab framework? If so, do you think this is a dumbing down of READ Plus because it is now framed as a dialogue, and based on your talk just now, there is no clarity on what measurement reporting verification system will be put in place for action under the scheme? And then there is another question again for Niki, in this case from Ishani, who is asking, how would you institute a mechanism to monitor the forest pledge, especially in terms of the land area not further deforested, as well as restores and the total carbon sequestered? So
Yeah, thanks.
I'll start. Yeah, you're in the floor, Niki.
So yeah, these are very good questions, and I don't think this fact roadmap is meant as a replacement for RED Plus. And I think, Nila, you raise a very interesting point, whether it sort of, how would that actually affect RED Plus? And I think, like I said before, what's very good is that it's specifically focused on the commodity driven agriculture. And I've been part of the global comparative study on RED Plus led by C4 for I think 15 years now, and they've done a lot of research on sort of how did RED Plus materialize. And you see it was a lot of project level stuff, and in these projects it was a lot of like focus on livelihoods and sort of basically targeting a lot of the smallholders. And you know, these are not, maybe locally they can be a main driver, but I don't believe that they're really the bigger cause of why we still have so much deforestation. So I think in that sense, I would, if I would look at it positively, I would say, well, this is sort of complementary to RED Plus, where RED Plus is maybe a bit more local and nationally focused. You also have some jurisdictional programs, while FACT might address more sort of the international supply chains and the companies that are involved, because with the classical RED Plus projects, you're kind of missing those companies. They're not really in that picture. So I hope it just sort of works in complementary to RED Plus. But indeed, I think if I read the pledges, that they're still sort of thinking about sort of aspects of traceability and transparency. So they still have to figure that out. So how are we actually going to do that? And there are some good examples around, for example, Trace. I don't know if that's a familiar, it's from the Stockholm Institute, I think. Together with some other institutes, they really look at sort of these supply chains. And I think more of these kind of things need to be done, where you could really have a more transparent supply chain. Because if you don't have that and you can't trace the source of the commodity, then it's quite difficult to keep people accountable for this sort of pledges. And I think the other question was more on sort of how are we going to monitor these forest pledges? And I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think one of the good things that came out of RED Plus is that there was a lot of attention to developing national forest monitoring systems in tropical countries. And we just recently did a study, and you really see that capacities, often using remote sensing instead of national forest inventories, because that's a lot more expensive, and it's for like remote forests not so easy to do that. But especially seeing the innovations in earth observations, I think we know where deforestation is happening. I don't think that's a problem. We even know that sometimes now. With my colleague developed an alert system where we know that within days. And I think Brazil was a very good example where they actually linked it very well to enforcement. Because it's, if you know it, but you don't really use that knowledge to do something about it. And Peru is working on that, for example. Mexico is thinking about including that as well in their national system. So I think that is not a problem. And the capacities are really evolving to do that. I think one of the things we try to do is also make it more accessible to other stakeholders, civil society, also maybe non-technical people, that you can follow that much more. I think the World Resource Institute with their Global Forest Watch also does a very good job at that. So I don't think that's a problem. Restoration is a little bit tougher because it's a very gradual process. Like if you cut a tree and the sort of what you see in Earth observation from full tree cover and bare ground, that's a very clear signal. A gradual sort of growing of trees and sort of the carbon that is sequestered is a little bit more tough, but we're getting at that as well. So I think that aspect shouldn't be a problem if people are willing and there is investment as well, and capacity still in countries or companies that are still struggling with that. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Niki, for your exhaustive reply. I will go through other different questions. The first one was related to the possible implications of the Paris Agreement. And so in other words, while we're talking about a non-legally binding instrument, judges may refer to the targets present in the Paris Agreement. So in other words, how this type of legal cases can be relevant for this type of discussion. And then another question is related to the Chinese and US climate pact that was a deal breaker during the COP. And so in this case, Thomas is saying that he felt that China backed down last moment with backing the changes proposed by India. How do you see the value of this joint declaration now after the COP? So I guess that both Elisa or Josephine can address these two questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I might try and combine with also another questions around what the role of academics in using human rights in this context, because I think they're interlinked. So I think that the question of whether or not the Paris Agreement or some of the commitments within the Paris Agreement is hard, legally binding international law or not is complex. I haven't necessarily engaged in that scholarly debate myself, but I think my position would be that for how much states tried in some ways to really differentiate the Paris Agreement from the Kyoto Protocol, so it's not called a protocol, there's not, the same approach of those globally set, legally binding targets. Instead, we have this like bottom-up approach. That doesn't mean that there is no legally binding law in there. I mean, for one thing, the Paris Agreement is still a subsidiary agreement to the Climate Change Convention, and we have legally binding law there, so that's one argument about it. But I think importantly, we really have to think about the legally binding nature of obligations, not from looking at regimes in isolation from each other. So what parties and governments are doing under the Paris Agreement is also relevant for other legally binding international obligations they have under the Convention on Biological Diversity, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and under their international human rights agreements. So in as far as we're able to show how non-compliance or insufficient efforts to implement the Paris Agreement are also having a knock-on effect and effectively leading to non-compliance with other international environmental obligations and international human rights law obligations, we have plenty of legally binding international law to rely upon. And in fact, and this goes to the question of what researchers can contribute here, I think as an international environmental lawyer, which is my background, I know that often it's hard to hold government accountable to their international environmental obligations because they often negotiate them in very open-ended terms. And so it's often very difficult to say, what's the limit of state discretion here in implementing, either really doing enough or not. But when you bring in international human rights law and you look at the interplay of those different areas of international law there, the advantage is that those international environmental obligations have a clearer minimum content. There's a limit to state discretion, and that limit is set to foreseeable and avoidable negative impacts on human rights. So by bringing together both the evidence base from the natural and social sciences and the legal arguments, I think that this whole question of what's legally binding or not, what's acceptable ambition, what's actually minimum compliance that we need becomes a much clearer area from a legal perspective. Sorry, can you repeat the second question? I got so worked up on this too. I forgot. I think you're muted, Francesco.
Sorry. So it's about the US and Chinese. About the US and Chinese pact. And so Thomas is asking if this pact was a kind of deal breaker during the COP. So in other words, he's thinking that China backed down last moment with backing the changes proposed by India. And so how do you in general see the value of this joint declaration within the framework of the COP?
Yeah, I think it's a very hard assessment, and maybe Josephine will have more things to say than myself. I mean, of course, it was talked about, but in terms of how much it meant in the negotiations, I'm not so sure. But I think, again, you know, this is the role the US has played even before, even in Paris. And I think the question is, you know, we have a multilateral framework. We need a global multilateral framework to address climate change, and for how much we really have to be careful how this unilateral or minilateral initiatives play out in the broader framework where we need, you know, collaboration across the globe. So I guess it's hard to say how much this helps, but I can see how also risks it brings in terms of undermining or somehow, you know, circumventing the efforts at the global multilateral level.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elisa. We also have another additional question. So maybe Josephine, you can reply about this US-China and also to another one, which is about implementation. And so in this regard, Manuel is wondering how research can combine effectively critical reflection on what has happened and in parallel constructively look ahead and advise on how to overcome challenging. So yeah,
I'm very happy to take that question. I already saw it come up in the chat, and I think it's an interesting one. But maybe just going back really briefly to the points that Elisa already mentioned on the role of the court. I very much agree with her perspective on this, and I think what's very difficult with all of these agreements is that in the end, you know, the difference between legally binding and non-legally binding in the international level, and what I'm about to say is hugely controversial among international lawyers, so do not, you know, feel free to cite me on this, but there will be blowback, I'm sure, from other sides. It's difficult to say what's really the added value of something being legally binding and not legally binding, because in the end, of course, there are so many other forces that will determine the level of commitment of specific countries to these kind of aims that I think it's almost, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, because I think it's a very important signaling device, and I think there are some international treaties that do have more powerful enforcement tools, but I think in the end, of course, what we're stuck with is the lack of an international enforcement body in general. And I think what's been really interesting about the cases that we've seen is actually not so much international mechanisms of upholding international law, but domestic courts starting to play a more active role in enforcing these international commitments. Now, not every country has the same view on this, and not every national court has the same view on this, but this is what we've seen happening in some domestic courts. And that, of course, then really changes the power of international law, because to ignore an international treaty commitment is one thing, but to ignore a domestic court ruling, that's typically viewed as very different and much more the nuclear option by everybody involved. So I think that's a really important thing that we've been seeing as a change. The other thing that I just wanted to briefly mention, and I'm mentioning this because it goes against all my own sort of cynical impulses as a lawyer, and I'm very hopeful as of this approach, but it goes against my sort of better judgment in some ways. I've been working a lot with somebody who's an expert on behavioral law, and we've written on, for instance, the value of the Paris Agreement, and especially the goal of 2 degrees and preferably 1.5, given that it wasn't legally binding. And one of the things that she's shown me is that a lot of behavioral work has indicated that the setting of benchmarks, even if they're not legally binding or anything like that, has a really strong behavioral effect on people. And I think by extension, and this is a more complex argument, which I won't go into right now, but also by extension on the actions of government. And by setting a baseline, which is 1.5, anything that goes past 1.5, we are actually viewing as a loss in the way that we would not if we would, for instance, set the baseline at 2.5 or 3. And there are some internal effects of that kind of baselining, which even in the absence of external enforcement does actually guide people's actions to some extent. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind. Even though some of this might be greenwashing, even though some of this might be, just positioning and rhetoric, in the end, it does help create certain kinds of baselines that we then measure our future performance against. And I think that's really important. I also wanted to very briefly come back on this point on China. So I think that China, it's in line with what I was just saying. Like, of course, it's not great if China steps out of these things. And of course, it's not great generally if we cannot get the big players on board. On the other hand, the fact that China is there at all, I think, is something that we should see as a positive. Like, China has made it very clear that multilateralism is not that interesting, and that it will not have its arm twisted when it comes to these kind of things. And I think, paying attention to what China is doing domestically, I think, is very important. And the fact that they're there, I think, is also important. Now, whether this will then ensure some kind of future, and I don't think it will, but I think the alternative would be worse. I think the absence of China, regardless of the outcome of its presence there, I think would be worse. So the question about how we then contribute to transformative change, I think, is a really important question. I don't have an easy answer for this. A lot of colleagues in Wageningen and also, of course, elsewhere are working on this question, right? How do we trigger transformative change? And I think what's interesting is that the EU believes, and this has been an explicit statement from Timmermans and his cabinet, that the Fit for 55 is transformative change, right? And this is not something that can be implemented through incrementalism. Sure, but how we then actually achieve that, the tools of that, I think they have not been as explicit on. So I don't have an easy answer for this, but I think it's a really important question for us to consider. And I think one of the elements will be to stop playing lip service to things like public involvement. I think we're very good at sharing our results with people, but I think, as the young people also said at Glasgow, it's one thing to be given a stage and it's another thing to be listened to, right? And I think what we need to stop doing is sort of speaking into the void and then just assuming that at some point it's going to bounce back. And I don't have easy answers for that, as I mentioned, but I think that's one of the things that we need to look at. Okay, I'll give the floor back to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Josephine. So there are two questions, basically focus on a similar topic, but with a different perspective. So on the one side, Chris is asking, it strikes me that there is much attention to indigenous people and local communities, but not to poverty. So the SDG number 1, is my impression correct? While on the other side, Pratik is asking, non-inclusivity of indigenous people and similar non-state actors, like younger people, for example, was a glaring problem at this COP. What do you think is the outlook for more inclusivity in the next COP? So, yeah, I don't know who wants to address this quite topical question. Maybe Niki, you want to add something?
No, I think this is really a bit outside my field.
Okay.
So I mean, I'm totally behind being more inclusive, but yeah, I don't know if I can say a lot about this question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. I think indigenous peoples have been very negatively impacted directly by not only climate change, but climate change response measures. And so they have been able, over time and with a lot of effort, I think, to become a much more visible voice in the international climate change regime. They also represent a good portion of the poor in the world. And I think it was really interesting for me to see how and that part was actually available. I mean, to see how satisfied they are, particularly with the local communities and indigenous people platform. So this is very much a community-led entity within the climate change regime, where they're able to share their knowledge, but also to develop programs to really support them and others in integrating that knowledge in the climate regime. So in a way, they do represent poverty as well as other issues. But I guess the question is, which other constituencies or also international organization would raise that issue? It is not necessarily very visible, I would agree. Partly, I wonder if it is more difficult for other groups to organize in the same way that indigenous peoples have over, decades. Partly, it's also understanding, for instance, the mandate of different UN organizations and how they should address that in their own work and bringing that into the climate COP. I think, again, I'm thinking around the role of ecosystem restoration for climate mitigation and adaptation purposes and how that could be a huge area also to address poverty. I mean, otherwise, to my mind, poverty and SDG 1, as well as other critical SDGs such as gender equality, etc., they all have to do with human rights. And so again, using the human rights-based approach means that at every step of the way, we assess who are the ones that are most vulnerable or most affected and why, and really have that systematic understanding of where decisions within the climate change regime might negatively affect particularly the poor, or where we're just leaving behind their concerns and needs. This, I think, also leads to our role as researchers and how we bring together the evidence base that can be used to make sure that poverty is not left behind in discussions on climate change. And not only showing where, governments and others are falling short, but also, and I think that's where ears are really open, where we can show that this is a good practice, that there are actually benefits in looking at all these different sets of obligation as an aligned and meaningful approach to really realize multiple benefits and SDG synergies. And we need to really, develop our research so as to support these kind of practices and then document those practices to help decision makers see that this is possible, it's actually helpful, might be even be more cost effective than other measures. And so that leads to the question about participation in the future climate COP. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it is quite likely that there will be, continued difficulties due to the continuance of the pandemic. I mean, also the next COP will be in Egypt, so maybe there's also security concerns there that may be different from the ones at this COP. But I think the reality is that now we have a work program which is meant to be on enhancing the role of different actors in the process and empowerment. It does not include human rights language, and yet states have committed in the Glasgow Pact to consider their human rights obligations in that context. And we need to invoke, and as researchers, maybe to help different right holders and stakeholders to think creatively about how they can be influential in the process, around the process, in preparation for the next COP. But it remains a big challenge, and it's hard to see that the next COP will be, there'll be a big improvement there.
Could I maybe add briefly to this? Because I always love being on a panel with Elisa because she reminds me of the human rights angle, which I tend to sort of, I don't want to say bypass, but you clearly have a much better view on this than I do. And whenever I hear poverty, I immediately look at the finance mechanisms, right? And I completely agree that we need to, the human rights need to sort of run through this entire enterprise. But I think one of the things that I've also noticed when it comes to the poverty narrative, which I think is really interesting and actually came up also in one of Niki's comments, is that I think to some degree, some climate behaviors in the past have really been sort of attributed to poor populations, saying, oh, well, but they're just not choosing sustainable options, and like people are just going for the cheaper options, or they can't afford. For instance, when it comes to deforestation, all these smallholders are cutting down the Amazon because they need food, and this is how poverty links in. And I think it's very good that we now are getting to a point where that is recognized as not being, of course, the main driver for these kind of massive climate systemic issues. And I think, of course, our entire economic system is something that we need to reconsider if we're actually going to tackle this. And I think much more than poverty being a driver for climate change, of course, climate change is a driver for poverty. And I think that's what we need to recognize much more. So I think obviously having a human rights approach based approach to the solutions that we're looking at, I think will help jumpstart, the kind of changes that we need to see. So I think that's really crucially important. But I think in line with that, or in addition to that, in parallel, I think we also therefore really need to think about the climate finance and how we can look at those kind of things. So I'm actually quite curious what's going to come out of the Just Energy Transition Partnership between the EU and South Africa, because I'm curious whether that might be some kind of blueprint for other kinds of actions in that direction. So that I don't know yet, but I'm quite curious to see how that might go. I also, sorry, this is a very random announcement, I'm sorry about that, but my battery is very low and I don't have a charger, so it's possible that at some point I will magically disappear, but then I will call back in with my phone. But I'm sorry about that. That's I was hoping I was going to make it to the end of our session, but it looks unlikely at this stage. But anyway, just so you know, if I disappear, I'll come back.
I mean, if I can add a little bit to that, and this is not so much COP26, but more in general about this point of transparency and participation of a broad range of stakeholders, is that also in monitoring, that's something you need to be careful for, because of course it's not a, even like people sometimes see Earth observation, for example, as a very neutral thing, but it's not, because you have to put it in a system and there is decisions to be made. And these decisions can also really affect sort of what is being measured and in what way. And, you can take a very sort of political economy look at these national forest monitoring systems. And I've worked with people and really looking at sort of, especially when it comes to drivers of deforestation, because this is still a bit harder to monitor, and you can really choose, for example, as a country, to only look at certain drivers or to tweak your forest definition in a way that is sort of suitable. All these power relations also come up here, of course, and who gets a say in what is being monitored and what is being viewed. You can also try to ignore things by designing your monitoring system in a certain way. And I think this comes also back to this newer question about transparency and a monitoring framework, because I think we really need to look at that more holistically, not only make technical decisions, but also really think about who do we include in that monitoring. You do see a lot of initiatives now where specifically Indigenous people and local communities try to use technology to also sort of help their own goals and defend their own territory, for example, when it comes to illegal deforestation and things like that. And I think this is also when you think about more these things of inclusivity, transparency, and human rights, that we should also look at these monitoring systems and not just think it's a technical thing, it's neutral. It's not. And I think, well, maybe with this community that's clear, but sometimes with the technical community, they don't always see it like that. And that's also where I think this more this view would help as well, I think, and then to be careful with that.
So thank you so much, Niki, for your additional reflection. I think that we basically address all of the question in the chat. So I don't know, Chiara, if you want to. Yeah.
There was a question by Nadia. I don't remember if you read it, Francesco.
Yeah.
You did, right? Yeah, it was about the human rights angle. Yeah. Yeah, then I think we have answered all the questions. We are perfectly on time, so unless there are any last-minute comments, I would like to warmly thank the speakers and also the many participants that were with us until the end. Of course, I would like to remind you that the recording of this meeting will be uploaded to the events webpage. So in case you want to watch it again or use it for your teaching or for your own interest, you will find it online. As concerns a potential third rapid reaction seminar, we are looking into organizing one in December because the European Union should publish the Commission's proposal for a directive on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And I'm glad to see actually Claire Bright here among the participants because she would be one of the speakers, hopefully. So in case the Commission actually publishes it on the 8th of December, we will have a webinar to rapidly comment on it on the 13th of December already. But it depends a little bit because it has been delayed for so many months that I will believe it when I see it. But follow us on the social media, follow the law group or myself, and you will be informed timely. Thank you very much once again. Thanks to the speakers for finding the time to prepare these presentations on a relatively short notice, and thanks to the participants, and we hope to, and thanks Francesco, especially for your precious help with the Q&A, and we hope to see you soon in another meeting. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.